What other holy book would be as honest as Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, if this event didn't happen, forget about it? I'm paraphrasing, of course.
I don't know why that's a measure of how truthful it is. I mean, that's just Paul talking out of his ass. Right? Like, I don't get why that should be convincing to anybody. I mean, basically what Paul is saying here is that, oh, well, if this didn't happen, then there's really no point in Christianity. And I mean, I would have to agree that unless Jesus died for sins, there's no point in Christianity. But that doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that Paul believes it. You can believe things that are not true. Starting right off the bat in the first 13 seconds, I don't see it getting any better than this.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the linchpin miracle in the Bible. Perhaps you're thinking, well, what about the incarnation? When Jesus Christ, God, became flesh, the problem with saying that's the linchpin miracle is you can't look at a baby and know that the miracle happened. You would say, well, his life testifies that he is God. I would agree to that. But the incarnation cannot really be observed, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ can, and it was.
No, it wasn't. All we have, as far as independent accounts of things, the only thing that we have is Paul. And all Paul says is that he had hallucinations. And then he repeats this creed that he got from others that were Christians before him, saying that, first Jesus appeared to Cephas, and then he appeared to all these people, which that part could be an interpolation or a spelling error. But in any case, and he goes on this list of people that saw the resurrected Jesus. But the point is that they saw a resurrected Jesus. So it was not like Jesus resurrecting, it was Jesus after he already resurrected. So we don't have any evidence of Jesus resurrecting, nor even being resurrected. We have evidence of most likely hallucinations that were occurring, that or people that were just mistaken, or they could have been lying about it. I mean, I don't know. I would think that lying would probably be the least probable out of the other solutions that I proposed, but I mean, it's definitely possible and far more probable than Jesus actually resurrecting.
Your entire life, your eternity is riding on this miracle, but we need to do some math. How do we even know about this miracle? Well, there was a book written about it. It's called the Bible, and that means you and I are relying on some eyewitnesses to be telling the truth.
Okay, so yes, there's no eyewitnesses in the Bible to Jesus's resurrection. There's just fictional accounts of Jesus's resurrection. That's not the part that I want to focus on with that here. Typically, apologists will tell you, "Oh, the Bible's not just one book. It's multiple books that were just put together in a collection." In this particular section, he talks about the Bible as if it were written all at once, or that it was all of this stuff came together sort of at one time. He may not mean that. I may be just reading a little bit too far into it, but I do want to point out how the Old Testament scriptures existed long before Christianity started. And in fact, they were mined for information about Jesus. So you have to take that into consideration, as well as the fact that Paul was writing first in around about the 50s. He was writing between the 50s and the mid 60s. And then the Gospels were written after that, ranging from Mark in the 70s, like between 65 and 70 or so. Mark was being written. Typically, scholars would say at least after 70. You have Mark, and then Matthew was written in the 80s. Luke was written at least after 93 AD. And then John is most likely written in the 2nd century. And then you have other books that are written in that time span as well. These are all coming from at different times. And the Bible that we know now, at least what we might recognize as the Bible, wasn't actually cobbled together until about the mid 2nd century. So you have to understand that it was far on into Christian history before this Bible was actually put together.
How do we know? You'll hear this slanderous accusation when you witness on university campuses. Well, other books get people to believe a lie. There's people who have been charlatans. What about Jim Jones? Valid point, but that is why we need to dig deep into these eyewitness biblical accounts. And what we are going to see is something unique from every other myth story. Let's dive in to our eyewitness accounts to see if indeed they are something that can be trusted.
Okay, so before he gets into his evidence for the Gospels being eyewitness accounts or that they can be trusted, like I laid out before, the Gospel authorship is a bit awkward. So as far as the gospel goes, there's really only one gospel that can be considered somewhat pseudo-independent, and that would be Mark, because he was the first gospel written. But more importantly, Mark's gospel is what seeded all of the other gospels. Matthew's gospel copied from Mark. Luke's gospel copied from both Matthew and Mark, and then John's gospel used all three of those in order to generate his gospel. But even then, I say that Mark is pseudo-independent because he's not really independent. Mark used Paul's writings in order to generate a lot of his information about Jesus, about his theology, about what Jesus said and did. So you have to take all that into consideration when you're thinking about these as eyewitness accounts. For one thing, they can't be eyewitness accounts. If you are directly copying off of another person's work, you are not, one, independent, and two, an eyewitness. Eyewitnesses don't have to copy off each other in order to get the story straight, okay? They if they're really eyewitnesses, then they should just tell their story. Mark himself, being that he copied off of Paul, and the fact that he doesn't cite any sources also means that he's not an eyewitness. He wasn't written by an eyewitness. It wasn't dictated by an eyewitness or anything like that. Mark contains no citations of sources. The only time that they mention some other work is when they're referencing scripture as where they got their information from. And that happens a lot throughout Mark, but it's most prevalent in Matthew's gospel. And so you really have to understand why it's ridiculous that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. There are no sources that they mention where they get their information from. They have information in those Gospels that nobody else should be able to have. Like, nobody should be able to like what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane. Nobody was around Jesus. Nobody knows what happened when Jesus went into his corner and prayed to himself. Nobody knows. Nobody should know, at least. So it's situations like that, or like what happened out in the desert when he was tempted by Satan or whatever, and he sat in that ring for 40 days and 40 nights or whatever in the fuck he did. Who was there to write all that shit down? Who? No. Oh, that's another thing. The disciples were illiterate peasant people. They could not afford to learn to read and write. They could speak Greek because that was the general language of the area, but there's no way that they could have went to school and learned how to write in Greek and all this other shit. So they definitely didn't write those accounts. Just keep in mind all of the problems surrounding considering the Gospels to be eyewitness accounts.